so glad you're here. Thank you for logging in to our March Everyman Live. As you know, this is our monthly webinar program. I'm glad you audience members are here, and we'd love to hear what you're up to. I want to know, what are your updates? What are your present states? So go ahead and populate the chat, with some chit chat. As you'll note, I have a co-host today, but it's a different one. So I'm Dr. Abigail Rue, the Director of Programs at Everyman Live, but joining me as a co-host this time is one of our Everyman co-founders, Lucas Crump. Lucas, how are you?
I'm great. I'm ready for spring. Tired of being cold and ready to step into the newness of spring. I love winter, but spring is kind of one of my seasons.
I'm in Texas, and so we're already beginning to get some spring weather here. We had a little St. Patty's Day outside music fest. Did you do anything for St. Patty's Day, or I don't know, I think March Madness is locking in. Are you doing anything with that?
Just, habitually picking the Jayhawks to win it all every year as an alumni. They let me
How are
down,
they,
but sometimes they pull it off.
how are these? I haven't, of course, I know UConn, aren't they set to possibly do a three-peat? And then I'm a University of Texas fan, and we're clinging on by our fingernails to barely even make it. How is Kansas?
They lowest seeding, I think, in the last like 30 years from Kansas. But this is the time when they kind of surprise us all. So
Oh,
we'll see what
good.
happens.
Well, audience, as you're logging in, I hope you can chat with each other and tell us what you're up to. Before we get to introduce you to today's guest expert, let's go over just a couple of the way this webinar works to make it a fruitful experience for all of us. As we hope, every webinar is informal yet informative conversation with a guest expert, and everyone's invited, whether you're a longstanding member of the Everyman community or this is your first time, you're welcome. We welcome the public, we welcome females, and we welcome your involvement. So Lucas, tell them how they can get involved as we interview our guest expert.
Yeah, lots of different ways to get involved. The sort of tip of the spear, become a member of the Everyman community. From there, you'll have access to all of our drop-in groups, all of our mental training programs, emotional health, all of that. And then always encourage guys to jump into fundamentals. As many of you know, guys that are on this call probably have done fundamentals, which is our 4-week online program, which we do every month. I kind of call it like it's the personal training before you get the gym membership. So consider fundamentals. And then we just announced yesterday, I believe, that we are returning to Racebrook, which is where Everyman started. Many of you have been there for our open source retreat, April 25th to the 27th. And one of our Everyman co-founders, Dan Doty, is leading that. I know there's already been a lot of spots that have been taken. So if you're interested in going, jump on it now. And if you have any questions, you can always email us, team, TEAM at everyman.com. But yeah, that's how you get started.
Awesome. So for today's webinar, please keep posting in the chats anything that you want others to hear, your updates. But just as a reminder, the last 20 minutes, and we're actually going to give more time this webinar than we have in the past for your questions. So separating the Q&A feature, that's where you type the questions on Zoom where you would like our guest expert to reply to. So we'll leave 20 minutes at the end for our guest expert to answer your questions. We're giving more time to that. The chat, fill it up as much as you want, but put your questions in the Q&A feature, the chatter in the chat. So let's get started to introduce our guest expert. I am really excited to have a return Everyman Live interviewee. This is Kristen Ulmer. Kristen is a thought leader on fear and anxiety. She is a master facilitator who provides a new approach to ending anxiety, unlike anything taught in the current circles. She is the author of The Art of Fear, Why Conquering Fear Won't Work and What to Do Instead. I bought it off Amazon. I'm sure you can get it wherever you'd like. And I highly recommend it. Some of the questions today are going to be coming from my reading because you want to have a conversation with the author after you read this great book. So I'm hoping to get you all excited about this moment here. Go ahead, Lucas, tell us more about her.
Yeah, I mean, you've probably heard Kristen on one of the many, many podcasts she's done. I think it was 150. just to name a few. She's also been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, TEDx Talks, Tim Ferriss's Tribe of Mentors. She is the expert on fear. And at the same time, she works a lot with large corporations such as Google, Citigroup, Costco, so on and so forth. So she is the expert, and we are excited to have her here in this fearless position today.
What I want to give is a little backstory on her, and we're going to ask her more to expand on it. But Kristen's backstory: she was the #1 female extreme skier in the world. That's an astounding run. She held this title for 12 years and was also voted by the outdoor industry the most fearless woman athlete in North America. So we have the most fearless woman and athlete who's going to talk, most fearless woman athlete talking to us about fear. Following this experience, she spent 14 years in intense Zen study, which helped her realize that the secret to high performance in danger sports is actually the same secret to high performance in any field. And most importantly, the key to solving anxiety and anxiety disorders. Welcome, Kristen. Lucas, take it away with the first question.
Yeah, absolutely. For the Everyman members on this call, you're probably aware fear is something that we've been talking about this month. And for me, fear was something in my own life when I started the Everyman journey almost 9 years ago. And so fear is unequivocally, absolutely present in all of our Everyman programs and our retreats. And it's something that we talk a lot about and deal with as men. And so I think to kick it off, my question is just like, how did you land on this topic, and sort of what sort of pulled you down the rabbit hole of fear?
Well, hi, everyone. Look, I just want to show you what's outside my window right now. I don't know if you can see that, but it's snow, a lot of snow. It snowed a foot yesterday. In my house, just outside my house here, and a few days ago it was 70 degrees. So it's a very interesting and vibrant morning. Excited to be here. So how I got interested in the subject is because I was called fearless as an athlete, but really more accurately, what was happening during my ski and athletic career, and did a lot of other dangerous sports besides big mountain extreme skiing, is that I was having a love affair with fear. That is not what people are expecting. Usually when they look at extreme athletes like Alex Honnold or Laird Hamilton, or Alex is the one that free soloed El Cap, or somebody like me, is that we seem fearless, or maybe we have damaged amygdalas, or we don't have the same fear response as other people, but actually we do. Everybody feels fear. Nobody's fearless. Nor should we want to be fearless. The romantic ideal of being fearless is unhealthy and not possible. And so I became interested in it because I believed my hype. I felt fearless during my athletic career, but mostly I just didn't feel scared or afraid, which is what I think most people associate with being in fear. So more accurately, I realize now is what I was doing was having that love affair with fear, and I had intimacy with fear. I was willing to feel it. And that is actually the secrets that we're talking about here today.
Very interesting. So I have one quick question. There's a myth, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm personally very interested in like the biology of fear. Do you believe they've said that there's sort of a different wiring in some of the athletes that you mentioned, brains, that allow them to have a different relationship with fear? Is it true or false from your perspective?
False.
False.
Yeah, the person
Say more.
Yeah, the person that people usually talk about is Alex Honnold, the one who free soloed El Capitan. He climbed it without ropes. There was a movie made. It won an Oscar for best documentary a few years ago. So there was some scientific studies done on his brain. He's a friend of mine. I also interviewed him about his relationship with fear for 2 hours. We didn't talk about his girlfriend. We didn't talk about his sport. None of that. All we did was talk about his relationship with fear, which, by the way, he had no idea what that relationship was. But the word on the street is that after this test, that he was determined to have a different kind of amygdala, or a lack of amygdala, or a different kind of fear responses as other people. And he said, that's ridiculous. It was a stupid test. He has fear just like everybody else. But what the difference is between him and everybody else, or with me, is two things. First of all, we're willing to feel fear, which most people are not willing to feel fear. And the second thing is, as for what to do with the fear that we're willing to feel, is instead of being in resistance to it or trying to let it go or replace it with calm or or rationalize it away, what we do is we have an intimate relationship with fear.
So I want to ask.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Abigail.
Along this intimate relationship with fear, you have a quote in your book, and you say rejection is the greatest fear you'll ever have. And when I think of, I mean, there are a lot of great fears that I would have, and it's curious you landed on rejection. Can you expand your thought process there?
When I think of the word greatest, like I think ice cream, like, oh, the greatest flavor is vanilla or whatever. I didn't mean it in that context. I meant it as it's just the most common fear I see, or the biggest fear that I see, which is rejection. And a lot of what that centers around is that everybody has fear. Nobody is without fear. There's a lot of people that don't feel scared or afraid, so they think they have no fear. But fear shows up in every single person, no exceptions. Just if you take risks in your business or sports or life, or even just having children, getting married, like these are all things that are going to result in more fear. And I would say that the reason why fear of speaking on stage in front of a public is greater than the fear of death is because of that rejection piece.
I'm so curious. One of my favorite quotes is this one from Teddy Roosevelt, which is, you probably know, but right, courage is not being fearless, but the ability to go forward despite our fear. And when I think about fear and what you just spoke of, and the fact that we all have this emotion, we often think, it's almost like a hot stove, right? You're like, wow, I don't want to touch that, but we should touch it, and we should embrace it, and we should feel it. And so I'm really curious, because I think it's biologically something present in all of us. So how did you go down the path of touching the hot stove, but then keeping your hand on it, and then learning to actually cultivate this relationship with it, which obviously propelled you forward as a skier and as a thought leader in this space?
I want to back up a little bit so that we have some framework from which your questions are being asked, and the framework and from which I'm answering them. Awesome. So we have this amygdala. It's the oldest part of our brain. It's two almond-shaped nuggets at the top of the spine. Like, our brain is not an it's a we. And so this is it seems like it's complicated, but it's not. It's actually very simple. Like, even a chicken has one. And all sensory data that comes into our system is run through this filter first. And it's not a thought-producing part of the brain. It's an emotion-producing part of the brain. So 11 million bits of data per second are coming into our systems, and that's per second. I don't know how the scientists figure that out. And if there's a threat, the amygdala will produce a shot of discomfort called fear that is supposed to flow through our bodies like water through a hose and provide for us on-point, intuitive, thought-free physical reaction. Now, it's proven by science that it just shows up in our bodies first. We usually think of fear in terms of scared or afraid. And so everybody asks me, like, okay, do we feel scared or afraid when this happens? And the answer is no. It's just a sense of discomfort. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fear. It's also not something specifically like a fears with an S that we can identify that we're afraid of. It's just, again, a sense of discomfort. And here's the thing, because so much is happening in our lives, 11 million bits of data per second, like, we are pretty much having fear flowing through our bodies every single moment of every single day, in pretty much every single interaction that we have, no exceptions. I feel it, you feel it, I'll feel it right now. Even if we never leave our house, it's there. And so our relationship with this emotion called fear is very, very important, because if we have a compromised relationship with it, if we're not in flow with it, we kink the hose, which pretty much everyone does because of what we're taught to do in society. That fear gets stuck in our system and then has no place else to go. And then it winds up showing up in a number of ways, either as an exaggerated version of itself that we now call anxiety or excessive worry, or it could show up as exaggerated anger, which is fear's fight energy. Many people actually even argue that anger isn't a separate emotion, it's just fear's fight energy. Or it'll now flood into our minds and our thoughts and show up as fears with an S of something specific, or it'll show up redirected in other ways that don't even seem like fear at all. Like I mentioned, anger or frustration or jealousy. Sadness is an interesting one. Like if we're really good at blocking out fear, like in denial that it even exists, well, we have to feel something. So men more typically feel anger because that's inappropriate, in our society. It's seen as kind of sexy, right? And fear feels powerless, but fear feels powerful. So they'll feel anger instead of the fear. So they may feel like they have no fear, but they have anger, that's their fear. Or it'll redirect again and show up as sadness. Usually when I feel fear, that's actually what I'm feeling, is just this other emotion of sadness. It's any kind of emotional discomfort that could show up as scared or afraid, which is an adjective, but fear's a noun. So it can show up in so many different ways. The other way it shows up for me is upset. So while in my ski career, I never felt scared or afraid, and I never had anything that I actually felt afraid of that I could identify, I would feel excitement is another way that fear shows up. Focused, present is another way that fear shows up. So when you look at these, like kids, for example, that seem fearless, they're not fearless. What they're doing is they're feeling excitement, and that's how their fear shows up. So it just shows up for everybody very different. So back to Teddy Roosevelt's quote. What was it again?
Courage is not being fearless, but the ability to go forward despite your fear.
So I don't like that, because I see fear as a person, and I'm not going forward despite it. For me, courage is a willingness to feel fear. I'm going to say it again. We're not doing it despite the fear. We're doing it because of the fear, or a willingness to feel fear will lead to courage. So people that do incredible things with their lives, we're back to my two secrets. They're willing to feel fear. They have intimacy with fear. And in many ways, like my ski career, or Alex Hunold, who free solos El Cap, we're doing it because of the fear, because we want to feel that aliveness and that excitement. So when we, just to back up again and just really big picture, when I'm talking about fear, I'm talking about any kind of discomfort in our bodies that feels emotional. And that could include physical discomfort, like lower back pain or something. I have a lot of clients that reach out to me and they're like, I know that this is emotional. It feels like 90% of it is stuck emotions in my body. That's how their fear is showing up, is physical pain.
This may get to this concept you call, I believe your phrase is shift the game of 10,000 wisdoms. And this is your teaching tool that you use with your clients and your book and in your presentations. And I'm guessing it's shifting away from ignoring fear, denying fear, but expand on what shift the game of 10,000 wisdoms is for our listeners.
So what Abigail is asking me about is the facilitation tool that I use when I'm working with clients. And it's a form of voice dialogue. And in Zen tradition, we are talked about as having 10 different states of being. Like imagine yourself, Abigail, as a corporation named Abigail. And in your corporation, your name is just a concept. And really what makes up who you are as a person is 10,000 employees that are running around in your unconscious mind, creating the product, which is you and your personality. So imagine now that these 10,000 employees don't know what their job description is, what their job title is, who's boss, what they're even supposed to be manufacturing, it would be a really poorly run corporation. And that's really what it's like to be a human being. It's like we have all these people, we could call them, running around in our unconscious world, creating me, Kristen, right? And so when I work with a client, I'll actually ask to speak to these people. And some of the most oft people that I ask to speak to are our thoughts, our mind, our thinking mind, the controller. I see these as people, and emotions. I see fear as a person. I see anger as a person. I see sadness as a person. And I'll speak to these people. So shift is where you shift out of the reality that you're in right now and become these people. And so everything that I teach about fear, I actually gained by speaking to a person called fear that lives in your body, Abigail, or anybody, and asking, you know, how is it going? So the shift is not shifting away from a pattern or habit. It's a teaching tool. It's a facilitation tool. And this is a long way of saying basically everything that I say about fear is not my personal philosophy. Everything I say about fear, I have heard from fear directly through my clients, fear using their brain, their mouth in order to communicate on its behalf. And basically fear has been saying and trying to get our attention humanity-wide for decades now, saying, stop resisting me. Stop trying to rationalize me away. Stop trying to understand me and control me. Stop trying to manage me. Stop trying to let me go. Stop trying to replace me with calm. When you do these things, I will not be denied. I will retaliate and I will take over your lives, which is kind of how we see fear in the world right now. Like the level of anxiety disorders. And I use the word fear and anxiety interchangeably. Nobody wants to admit to having fear, so they're calling it anxiety now, but it's basically fear that's stuck in our bodies, that's screaming at us, trying to get our attention. So in many ways, what I am is the PR director for fear, trying to reverse cultural norms and habits and treatments for anxiety, for that matter, that are resistance-based, because they don't connect us with fear. They fight a war against fear, and fear is retaliating now and acting out in the ways that we're now seeing in our society. And it's our fault we did this. And so I'm here to help people reverse that, so that issues that they have in their lives that seem emotional get reversed, and you have a better relationship with fear.
I bet you really hated those no fear bumper stickers. Like,
Oh.
what? Yes, fear. Put a place at the table with fear. I'm gonna have Lucas ask the next question, but I want our listeners to know that we want to answer your questions. So feel free to populate any questions that have come up into the Q&A feature, and in 5-10 minutes we'll make sure we get those addressed. Go ahead, Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, Kristen, I love this conversation. Thank you so much. I'm thinking of what we often hear in our groups, in our programs, in our retreats, and I'm following your train of thought. And what often comes up, and I can also reference my own personal experience, but like, we oftentimes on the other side of fear are consequences to the action, right? And so how do you rationalize the consequences? Because it feels like, okay, if I do this, there will be consequences. So I'm afraid of, or I'm feeling fear because of those rational consequences. And I think of you, it's like in your skiing career, if you go too fast, you could wreck and harm yourself. So how do you sort of hold those two thoughts or feelings or experiences and go for and continue?
Well, I want to make this relevant for the audience.
Please.
And I think what you're asking is, how can we trust fear, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, if you're going to do anything with your life, and I mean, even just be alive, you're going to have fear. And the reason why we don't trust fear at this point is because we all have such a compromised relationship with fear that it's retaliating in ways that seem really irrational.
Mhm.
And so we start to believe that fear is like the whole reason why we have problems with fear in the first place is because we think that we should be getting rid of it.
Mhm.
So let me give you, let me see, I'll try to give you an example. So let's say somebody wants to start a business and they feel like they have to have no fear before they can proceed. And so they
Mhm.
gather as much information as they possibly can on launching a business, about marketing, about market shares, about whether it's a viable business. You know, they do all this stuff to limit fear. And
Right.
once they feel like they've limited fear enough, then maybe they proceed, or they continue to procrastinate because they're not in the mood for fear. They, you know, and then they let's say they do launch the business, and all of a sudden they have way more fear than they normally would, because, which is normal and natural. You know, deciding to take a risk, deciding to launch a business, deciding to step out of your comfort zone is the same as saying yes to fear. I'm going to invite more fear into my life.
Great.
And then all of a sudden they have all this fear and they don't know how to handle it. And so they kink the hose, they become numb, or they try to block it out, or they drink alcohol, or they smoke pot, or whatever it is that they do to try and get rid of fear. Calming practices, they take up meditation. And all of a sudden, you know, that they're also working really hard to run away from their fear. All of a sudden they can't sleep because their undealt with fear during the day is waking them up in the middle of the night, invading and flooding into their minds because the hose is kinked and it has nowhere else to go. So now it shows up in our thoughts. And then they're taking sleep meds, and they start to think that there's something wrong with them. And there isn't something wrong with them, but what it is they have habitual patterns around their fear that kink the hose, that cause it to flood into their minds. They also have all these resistance patterns that they've developed, and all of a sudden their life is just a mess. They can't sleep, and it just gets worse. And then all of a sudden they have this excessive worry, and they have other issues, like they get migraines, or they have, you know, they develop some sort of physical issue that, you know, where did that come from? And the doctors can't figure out what's wrong with them. They have an anxiety disorder, then they have their first panic attack, and on and on and on. And we start to think that fear is the problem, and that the fear
Right.
is coming from having started the business, and that we need to quit doing the business, or else we're going to die a slow, painful death, or die 20 years younger because of the fear. And we don't realize that it's actually our relationship with fear that has caused all these problems.
Right.
Now, if you back up, you know, and actually start at the beginning, and first of all, this is actually the way to have a healthy relationship with starting business, is realize that you are going to invite more fear into your life. Ask yourself, am I in the mood for more fear? Which a lot of people who are retired, for example, and they're like, oh, I'm so bored, right? So they want to invite more fear into their lives. Thus, they start another business. So reframe it into seeing it as saying yes to fear. And then once the fear shows up, it's normal and natural. I am supposed to be feeling this, and I'm in flow with it all. And the fear, it's like I'm Batman and fear's Robin, helps me be more sharp and focused and on point and present, and bring my A game to the things that matter most. There's no kinking of the hose. We're in flow with it. And so we can sleep at night, and the fear actually helps us be more successful, and on and on. So looking at these two examples, if you kink the hose on fear, and if you say no to fear, you won't even start the business. If you kink the hose on fear when you start the business, your life will slowly digress into an absolute mess. Takes about 10 years before, you know, you have a panic attack, whatever, insomnia, headaches, anxiety disorder, anger issues, you know, all of a sudden your relationships go south. Like literally, if you have any problem in your life, your compromised relationship with fear either has something or everything to do with it. Versus if you say yes to fear consciously and you're in flow with it, it'll help you be successful. Do you see the difference?
I mean, night and day. And I love the reframe. It's really refreshing.
Right. And if fear is acting irrational And just know, like, see it as a person in your life, or somebody that you have a war against. And it's really hard for somebody that's at war with another person to ever just stop and take inventory and realize that it's actually them that's the problem. Whenever we're at war, it's always the other person, right? It's their fault. But with fear, if fear is acting irrational and you've declared war against it, you're trying to control it, you're trying to get rid of it, you're trying to rationalize it away. These are all forms of war, using your mind like a sword to fight it. Know that it's an unwinnable war. You are not going to be able to understand this person called fear. You are not going to be able to control it. You are not going to be able to manage it for more than a moment or a day. You may win a few battles, but ultimately this war is unwinnable and it is the wrong effort. And you caused it. Fear is only a good thing. Fear is only a good thing. It's only a good thing. It's uncomfortable, but it's only a good thing. And it's one of the best parts of life. But if you pick a fight against fear, and pretty much every single self-help guru, psychologist, doctor, whatever, all help support wars against fear.
Right.
Just know that that's the support you're going to get. Fight this mighty battle, conquer and overcome fear. Fear will retaliate, and it's going to show up in any number of problems in your life. And so it's even modern definitions of emotional intelligence are about understanding fear as a way to manage or control it. Like all these things we do, letting it go, meditating it away, replacing it with calm, all of these things are offensive to fear, and it just exacerbates the war. So going back to the beginning, it starts with you owning, or us owning, that we caused this. If fear is acting irrational, it's because we're the asshole, right? And given fear no choice but to retaliate. So it takes that ownership as a starting point to turn the relationship with fear around. And it's kind of like that with anyone. Like if you don't get along with your parent or your child or your roommate, just by saying, you know what, I've been such a jerk to you. I totally get why you've been such a jerk back. I am really sorry. Let's start over again. It actually is very fast that you can turn your relationship with fear around by taking ownership and apologizing to fear. And then we can start over.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, and I just think like all fear makes us better. If I was to sort of reframe, but yeah, thank you, Abigail.
Can I say something about that? Because it's really important what you just said. We have this impression, like this is a wisdom story, but I'm sitting under a walnut tree looking at a watermelon patch. And I'm thinking, oh, nature got it wrong. Like here's this robust tree and these tiny little walnuts, and here's these tiny wimpy little vines and these huge watermelons. Like nature got it wrong. And then all of a sudden a walnut fell out of the tree and landed on my head. I'm like, oh, okay. So we have to understand that nature, with regard to fear, did not get it wrong. It's such a normal, natural addition, an important part of our lives, not just to keep us safe. I mean, humans wouldn't even exist if it weren't for fear, but also to keep us from being bored, and to make us strong and really become clear about like, okay, what do I really want in life? Am I willing to be uncomfortable in order to get it? And on and on and on. It is such a motivation. It is such a source of aliveness. And our relationship with it pretty much determines every single aspect of our personality and life choices. And so when we think that it's a problem to be solved or that nature got it wrong, we really mess up our lives. But when we really get that nature didn't get it wrong, that it is supposed to be part of our lives, then all of a sudden we can have a healthier, more flowing relationship with it.
You are Fear's ambassador, Kristen. Fear's lucky to have you on her team, his team. I want to get some really great questions that our listeners have been posting. What do you suggest for dealing with irrational fear?
Well, I've kind of been covering that. If fear is irrational, I mean, I hate to say this, but it's your fault. You've kinked the hose on fear. It's now flooded into your mind and it's recirculating round and round. See it as a person that's desperate to get your attention. And it's acting out in an irrational way. Like a child, if you lock a child in the basement or if you mistreat them, they start to act in a very immature, irrational way. And at whatever age we stop dealing with fear in a flowing way, that's the age to which it's developed. So if age 4, dad said there's nothing to be afraid of, we start, hearing all the things in our society. Fear shaming is just rampant. If at age 4, we lock fear in the basement, we want nothing to do with it, the basement being our body, it'll flood into our minds and just kind of act out in like a 4-year-old kind of irrational way. So if you have irrational fear, just know that you kink the hose and you got to unkink the hose and get back and flow again with fear the way nature intended. And then it'll stop flooding into your minds. It'll stop jumping up and down, desperate to get your attention. And it'll just turn naturally into a resource of aliveness and flow instead.
How do you unkink the hose? Do you have successful stories or good tips, good advice you could give our listeners for this unkinking the fear hose?
If somebody is really ready to undo the damage of kinking the hose and actually turning away from society norms on what to do about fear and getting back in flow. And usually this is only when people are desperate. Here's what to do in really clear terms. First of all, we got to take ownership of our resistance patterns. Everybody, 8 billion people on the planet, 8 billion different resistance patterns. Some people drink alcohol and do drugs, smoke pot every day or what have you, or take anti-anxiety medication to medically get rid of their fear. Other people, whenever they feel fear, turn to exercise, going out and going for a jog, or other people meditate, like calming meditation as a way to replace fear with something more in line with what they'd rather feel. Other people try to let it go. Now, this is probably going to be very, very surprising to people, but to fear, trying to run away from fear using alcohol or drugs, or running away from fear using exercise or meditation, it's all the same. It's all just resistance practices and coping mechanisms. So, just taking inventory and really seeing what your relationship is with fear is definitely the first step. And that's what I always do with new clients is first we have to see what your relationship is with fear. As in the words of Dr. Phil, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. So it's just examining our lives and examining to see what kind of reactions to fear have become our norm or our habitual patterns. And then once you see them, sometimes that just stops them on a dime, like, oh, okay, I realize now that I'm eating all this food to not deal with my fear, or I'm so busy, I'm making myself so busy so as to not feel fear. Or the biggest form of resistance to fear that I see, this is really interesting, is we're so in our heads all the time, so we don't have to feel the emotions in our bodies. And if you do that, back to irrational fear, then that fear, in order to get your attention, will go to the place where you live, which is your mind or your thoughts, in order to get your attention. Because if that's where you live, that's where it'll go, and jump up and down there and hijack your mind. So seeing those resistance patterns is the first part. And then apologizing is the start of kind of changing your language around fear, talking about fear in an inclusive way. And again, I use the word fear and anxiety interchangeably. We just call it anxiety now because stigma. There's such a stigma around fear. Whereas like no guy working in Wall Street would ever say I'm pickled in fear. He'd be the laughing stock. But he says I'm pickled in anxiety, and that's kind of socially acceptable, even though he's saying exactly the same thing. So start talking about your fear, your anxiety, your anger, your sadness. Oops. in an inclusive way. Like that Teddy Roosevelt quote, that is so disrespectful. The language around it. Stop talking about it in terms of conquering or overcoming fear.
Right.
Also so disrespectful. Like see fear as a person. If you're ever wondering about the language, if I want to, and I call these dreaded commas. Like there's a lot of healthcare practitioners that, oh, you want to find your fear, find that person, right? You want to connect with it. You want to accept the fear, right? Okay, accept it. Still a little bit heady. You want to feel the fear, right? Okay, great. We're connecting in an emotional way. Comma, here's the dreaded comma. Now let it go, right? And we're right back to resistance. Or now not let it get the better of you, or you can't let it take over your life, and we're right back to having a compromised relationship with fear. So get rid of the dreaded comma. Only speak about fear in a positive way. And then the next step is you want to connect with it emotionally. We're so used to dealing with our emotions intellectually because of what we're taught through emotional intelligence definitions. What you want to do is learn how to feel it, period.
Yeah.
Not feel it, then comma, let it go. No dreaded commas, right? Just feel it. And it sounds so simple, just feel your fear. And then fear will just like go back into your body, get out of your mind, and then just it just turns into no big deal, and it'll just naturally start to be in flow on its own. And then feeling eventually turns into the intimacy that I'm talking about. It's kind of like I have a cat. If you're in resistance to the cat, imagine your life, and imagine that your cat is by your side every single moment of every single day of your life, and you're in resistance to the cat. What kind of life are you going to live? If you accept the cat, right, it's a step in the right direction, but there's no love there, and it's very heady. Now, if you feel the cat, all of a sudden you're not having a intellectual experience with it. You're having a physical experience with it. There's no thought once you start to feel the cat. And then feeling leads to intimacy with the cat. And all of a sudden you have this beautiful dance with this cat. And it's one of the best parts of your life. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm going for. And I probably should have said snake instead, because who doesn't like cats? Whereas snakes are, but if you're in resistance to the snake that's by your side your whole life, accepting, step in the right direction, still heady, and usually followed by a dreaded comma. Now you're feeling the snake, now you're connecting in an intimate way, and all of a sudden the snake becomes your best friend and greatest source of aliveness. It's the same with fear.
I appreciate that. That was very detailed about what to do. So I appreciate the advice. Let's get a couple other audience questions. Lucas, why don't you pick one?
Yeah, and I just appreciate it so much because it reinforces a lot of the work that we do around just feeling our feelings and learning the tools to be able to do that. Fear being a big one of those, big part of that. Mike from the audience has a question, and it's interesting because a lot of EVRYMAN members are leaders, right? And in the context of work, fear is often a tool that is used to lead. And at the same time, if you're leading a team, every person in that team has a different relationship with fear. So how do you sort of normalize the fear, but obviously not use fear as a tool to motivate, or what would be the framework that you would apply or to think about that as a people leader and a leader?
Well, backing up to all the pieces of advice that I just gave, everybody on your team is going to have a different relationship with fear. And you can, once you start to understand how people's relationship with fear affects pretty much every aspect of their personality and life choices, you begin to see what these people's relationships are with fear very, very quickly. Like, for example, like a controlling person in your office, they're the belief is that we can control fear, but we can't control fear. Nobody likes to be controlled, certainly not somebody as old and wise or has as strong a personality as fear. And once we realize we can't control fear, we want to start to try to control anything, anybody, you know, in order to limit our fear. So we wind up being super controlling to the people in our lives, at home or at work. And then we make them deal with our fear on our behalf. Like if somebody has anger issues, for example, that's undealt with fear, usually, especially if it's showing up as rage or blame. Then, you know, it's like you become like a monkey throwing your poop at other people in the office, you know. Or you, like I remember I had a client, a mother who had a 12-year-old son who really made his mother deal with all of his fear on his behalf. You know, he didn't want to take the school bus to school. She had to drive him. She had to walk him to his classes. She just had to reassure him all the time. You know, that's basically making other people deal with your fear. And on and on. I mean, it's once you start to see this, like the world I live in, being a fear specialist, like I can pretty much understand what somebody's relationship is with fear pretty quickly just by observing them and their behaviors. So I would just start, I mean, if somebody wants to hire me, I would help everybody in their office see what their relationship is with fear that they probably have no idea about. There's for sure somebody in your office that feels like they have no fear. These people are the most dangerous of them all, because then it's really gone covert and underground and showing up in a shadowed way. And it could show up in so many different ways. So that understanding is the first part. And like I said, most people have no idea what their relationship is with fear. I mean, if Alex Honnold doesn't know what his relationship is with fear, probably Joe in HR probably doesn't know either. So, as for language that you can use, just if you want to skip the first step and just, I don't know, just, I would not use the word fear in conversations because it has such a stigma. And most people assume that you're suggesting that people are scared or afraid. Again, fear is a noun and scared or afraid are adjectives. It's very, very rare that fear shows up as scared or afraid. I've hardly ever seen it. I've kind of never experienced it in my life. A few times, but you know, it was pretty dramatic experience, like a snake jumped on my head. Anyway, so there's so much that I can say about this. I would probably use the word discomfort or uncomfortable instead of fear, just to get rid of the stigma. And I wouldn't even use the word anxiety because we're not really at the point where people are willing to admit to anxiety. I mean, in very small certain circles, but certainly not at work. You know, that's also pretty taboo. But I would say things like, if anybody feels uncomfortable, I would like to hear about it. It's also important that everybody stays in their own lane. Maybe you've heard this term. You know, I mentioned the person that's like a monkey throwing their poop. That's like, I'm not dealing with my fear. I want you to deal with it on my behalf. I mean, you know, this is a hard question to answer because 8 billion people have 8 billion different unique relationships with fear. And that results in 8 billion different, if it's a compromised relationship, with pretty much everyone's relationship with fear is compromised at this point. That means 8 billion different weird problems that come from that. And so it's not a one size fits all answer, but it really comes down to helping people understand what their relationship is with fear, if possible, and then just being inclusive of people's discomforts as a way to just kind of change the environment in the work place just even a little bit.
No, it's beautiful. Thank you.
We've got time for just one last audience question. So I'm going to read. This is from Justin. Kristen, do you believe you can damage your brain from long-term exposure to too much fear or adrenaline? Does life ever seem mundane after experiencing so much fear for so many years?
I want to really make it crystal clear. Fear does not damage us. Our resistance to fear is what damages us and causes our central nervous system to be hyperactive and wonky, and causes us to have incredible shakiness or health issues, and on, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual health issues. However, I actually do think that if you become addicted to fear like I was, that can also be dangerous, because it's no less dangerous than a heroin addiction. You just need more and more and more of it in order to have that sense of aliveness. And we see this in danger sports athletes, it's just constantly upping the ante. And also in danger sports, you know, like I've had over 60 near-death experiences. Easily 100 of my friends have died doing these sports. It's probably more. Hundreds more are crippled for life. Like, this stuff is, you know, super dangerous, right? And heroin kills and fear addiction kills. Like, it's but the other thing that I've learned is that most extreme sports athletes have a resistant relationship with fear. And that is probably not what you're expecting. Because of society norms, modern definitions of emotional intelligence, positivity at all costs mindset, and rampant fear shaming, most extreme athletes are actually in resistance to fear in order to ski or perform the way they want to. I would say, though, for the most part, the best of the best of the best in the world, like the #1 in the world, has moments of intimacy with it, kind of like I did, you know, but it's more of a paradox. You know, I may have intimacy with fear some days while I was skiing, but other days I was in resistance to it. It's like when you make your life about only one thing, which for me it was about fear. It's not just all love or all hate, kind of like relationships, you know, you can love and hate your husband or wife at the same time, right? And it doesn't mean that I am in flow with my fear in other areas of my life, like in my relationships, or you know, when I give a speech on stage or do a podcast, or, you know, it's like we all have such complicated relationships with fear. And here's the good news too. I find that it's not all or nothing. You know, just like 1% more willingness to feel fear and have intimacy with it can make somebody be the best in the world at a really dangerous sport for a really long time, and still be able to sleep at night and not wind up with PTSD, even though they've seen a lot of their friends die. And that same 1% is all that we need to turn around an anxiety disorder. It's not all or nothing. So just a little bit more in flow with fear just dramatically changes things in our lives. But you know, I will say that at the end of my ski career, just to come full circle on that question, I definitely was in a bad place. My adrenal system was crashed. I was exhausted. I was burnt out, and I had you know, I become really rigid, and which led to injuries because it's a violent sport. But all of those things came from my resistance to fear, not from the fear itself.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, and I know you do too. If we could go to KristenUlmer.com, Kristen, tell them what they can take on your website if they want to go there. It's a fear test. I'm not sure I'm phrasing it right. Why don't you tell them what they could join from looking at your website?
It's called my Free Fear and Anxiety Assessment. It's a series of 20 really, really interesting questions that are themselves insightful, so that people can start to figure out what their unique relationship is with fear. And then afterwards, it gives a one of three, you know, either you're in flow with it, or you're in resistance to it, or you have some sort of dramatic paradox, and then gives you advice on what to do next. It's very specifically targeted to your specific relationship with fear. It's super interesting. I totally encourage it.
I'm definitely doing it. I appreciate it. Before I say what's happening with our next webinar a month from now, Lucas, any final thoughts?
No, I just want to thank Kristen. Just personally, this was incredibly insightful, and I know the audience gained a ton from it. I'm going to be thinking a lot. But no, thank you so much for your time and just sharing your wisdom and expertise with us and the men in this community and women.
Yeah, I think my two biggest takeaways were fear is positive, and I just need to run that through my head. Fear is my friend, and I'm going to go to your website and take the fear exploration. So really, thank you, Kristen. This has been great. This will be recorded and put on our website for members, and I know we'll have more people watching it. So if in case you missed something, you can go back and get more. These Everyman Lives happen once a month, always at this time. So I wanted to give you a little snippet about what you can look forward to for April 16th. That will be our next one, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, and we're in between. We've invited Ashante Branch to come be our guest expert. Ashante is the teacher we all wished we had. He is really passionate about helping today's youth, especially African-American and Latino males, to develop the emotional maturity to live with intention as opposed to living with reaction. So I hope you get excited and put April 16th, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Pacific to listen to Ashanti. Between now and then, go to everyman.com. You heard all the things Lucas said that we're doing. And one last thank you to Kristen for all that you shared with us, that my new friend Fear, I benefited from this, and I really appreciate not only reading your book, but I got a lot more just from listening. So I'm Dr. Abigail Rue. It was a pleasure spending time with you. I'll let you all sign off and have the final word.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you, Kristen. Go ski.
I guess just the final word is, if fear is acting in a weird way, it's your fault. Make friends with fear. It'll stop.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Get back to your Wednesday. Appreciate it. Take care.